Eastern Time, about 50 minutes plus from now. You'll see live coverage of that, as you always do here on C-SPAN. Now we turn to our second of our roundtable discussions this morning, and we begin with James Fallows, who's Washington editor of the Atlantic Monthly. Good morning. What are you reading today?
I'm reading in the New York Times, among my great pile of newspapers. I think the most important story today is this China story, because it's where the U.S. is going to impose trade sanctions because the Chinese are cranking out these CD-ROMs for $2 and $3 a piece. I think this, for the next 20 years, the next 50 years, we're going to see stories like this about China, because it's the first time, I think, in this century where we've had a power of this magnitude that we're going to have to deal with on so many different fronts, potentially military, commercial, cultural, whatever. So that's the first thing I was reading. Give us your perspective on the policy that is being suggested in this piece and whether or not it will affect the issue. Well, I think that the Clinton administration is doing something that they have to do, of saying it is not tolerable to have this mass reproduction for basically for free of intellectual property, whether it's computer programs or VCRs or music or books from China, and so it's having to impose some kind of sanction. The question is, will this make any difference to the Chinese? What will happen next year and 5 years from now? And will the Chinese turn to European suppliers for their goods out of pique with the United States? So it's going to be a very long game. Last week we had a gentleman who's a Chinese American in talking about this story, just from his perspective. He was just visiting the office, and he said that because of the collective society roots, the idea of ownership is a difficult one for the Chinese to comprehend. That sounds completely farcical to me. If you've seen any Chinese-owned business, any place on earth, the idea of ownership comes extremely naturally to the Chinese. I think the idea here is if you can get something for free, it's better than having to pay for it. So I think that's the underlying idea. William F. Buckley, also at the table this morning, who is the founder and editor-in-chief of the National Review. What are you reading today?
Editor at large.
Editor at large, thank you.
What do I read today?
Yes. What stories are in play that are particularly interesting?
Mr. Fallows is interested in me in China, just like that. But I, coming as I do from the free trade tradition, I'm inherently mistrustful of any idea of deciding what the damage is that's being done and having an offsetting tariff exactly equal to it. It seems to me that you should have free trade, or you should recognize that there's some sort of a political war going on, in which case a complete boycott is I think logical. They say to them, okay, we're going to trade, and you're not going to steal any of our stuff, and that's an economic arrangement. If you're going to make it a political arrangement, then we'll stop trading. Any effort to say, okay, we're going to charge 19 cents more per cufflink is going to end you up in the kind of arithmetic that is almost always impossible to justify, with all kinds of special interests asking for more protection for their cufflink. Let's suppose they were printing the National Review for free in Shanghai or whatever and shipping it over here for 10 cents a copy. Would that justify, do you think, either just ignoring it or saying, okay, a complete political war with China? No, I think it's de minimis. I once found a copy of my then bestseller at the hotel in Taiwan, en route to do a firing line with the president of Taiwan. So I picked it up and asked him to autograph it. I bought it for $1 there, had to pay for $15 in New York City, but he sort of giggled, but I think that's simply a de minimis situation. However, if I were in the business of publishing books, I would say this is theft. You may remember when Adlai Stevenson lost the presidency in 1952, his commission, when he went back into private life, was to go to Moscow and to argue there to try to get Moscow to enroll in the copyright union. He failed, by the way, as usual.
What else are you reading?
I'm reading, of course, a story about the aftermath of this crash in Florida. And I have let us proclaim ourselves that we don't know what actually happened in this crash or anything about ValueJet, although confess I have avoided flying ValueJet for the last year or year and a half, just having done it once or twice. What is interesting...
Well, why did you avoid it?
It looked so strange. Just the airplane looked old. There was a kind of I'd flown on airlines, as I'm sure you have, in both China and Vietnam, and I thought this is a little bit too similar here. And if I had the choice, it's worth paying $100 more to go on a more carefully regulated airline.
Well,
Again,
I'm glad you did.
Yeah, I am too. I actually was.
Could I just ask, you said more carefully regulated. Aren't all airlines regulated by the same?
Well, that's the point I was going to make. I gather there was an FAA warning or manifesto or whatever a couple months ago saying that Value Jet deserved special attention. Now, I am not presuming to know what happened in this actual crash. The point I'm making is that we've had for the last, say, 10 or 15 years, largely under the intellectual leadership of Mr. Buckley and his allies, a sense of the burden of regulation and how it should be lifted. And I think it may be time for a Teddy Roosevelt-like swing back towards saying there are certain cases in which regulation, let's say, of airlines may be more necessary.
Well, I'm terribly interested, and I'm sure you are, in the intellectual point. Somebody said the other day, a 30-year-old airplane is as reliable as everything as a day-old airplane, if indeed it has been checked regularly and exhaustively. I tried that out, and I had the wonderful luck of having lunch with the head of the Atlantis mission. It just finished 144 flights around the world, Colonel Chilton, and he said that he knows of no test that actually can measure mental fatigue. And another thing that tends to throw you off is the number of times the plane goes up and goes down increases the gravity of the tensions on it, so that to say how many hours it's flown is not a reliable index of what it has been subjected to. But did you buy in on the thesis that if properly inspected, a plane today is just as good as 30 years ago? The DC-3s fly all the time.
I don't know enough really to say, and I guess the feeling I had as a passenger on this airline, again, not making claims about this tragedy, is that corners were being cut in many ways, and I didn't want it wasn't worth the money to me. And I guess the question is, what sorts of corners were being cut?
Let me add an article in that's related about airlines and public policy. This is page 2 of this morning's Wall Street Journal. Michael Frisby and Asra Nomani. Plane crash may force Clinton to stop talk about cutting air travel costs. The headline, the Clinton administration's campaign to take credit for making air travel more affordable may have been shelved in the wake of Saturday's Value Jet crash. Throughout his term, President Clinton has tried to win the hearts of middle-class voters, and claiming a major role in lowering airfares seemed an easy way to do it. Transportation Secretary Federico Pena recently said the administration had saved consumers $6.3 billion in just the past year by fostering new carriers.
This is interesting. I hadn't realized the Clinton administration was the father of this movement. Actually, Alfred Kahn, who was a Carter administration appointee, was the one who really sort of broke the regulation mentality. And in general, I think that's been wonderful. The question is, in airlines, in pharmaceuticals, in food, in medical care, can too much deregulation be a good thing? And I guess that will be the test case that comes from this.
Well, no, I think we're paying a lot for deregulation. I'm persuaded when Alfred Kahn says, look, the average cost per passenger mile is now 62 cents, whereas it used to be 67 cents. But on the other hand, I can't fly to Omaha or San Antonio because of the hubs get in your way constantly. So we are paying a high cost of usefulness as a result of mashing the whole industry into these very narrow measuring devices that get you there the cheapest way. You can push a computer and tell you I get San Francisco to Boston, say, for $100 less than flying there by going to Salt Lake City and Milwaukee or whatever. So there definitely has been a downside to it.
I'm going to tell you about joining in our program. As you know, we always enjoy your participation, and we'll go to calls in about 2-3 minutes. C-SPAN phone numbers, our fax line, and our email address will be on the screen, so you can dial in and talk with William F. Buckley or James Fallows this morning.
Say something outrageous, James.
Okay, actually, here's what I want to talk about. On the bottom page of today's Washington Times, do you live in D.C., Susan, or in Maryland or Virginia?
Virginia.
In Virginia. I live in D.C., and our mayor, Marion Barry, has come back from his rehabilitation stint. What I think is really interesting here and deserves the attention of most Americans who live outside D.C. is the status of D.C., which is just intolerable, and it really doesn't have to do with Marion Barry anymore. I think that, I didn't vote for him. I think that he has not been the ideal mayor at this time of history, but it's not about him. It's about the strange political and economic anomaly that this district has become, where I, unlike most viewers, I have no representation in Congress. I have no control over how money is spent in my city. And
instead of controlling the whole country.
but it's
if you get out of New York and Connecticut, I'll give you D.C.
But it's become there is a. if the conditions on our roads, if you or I were observing them in Manila, we think, gee, this is a sign of a society going wrong. And there's gigantic potholes that impede one's movement around the city, and it's just not worthy of a first world country to have a city run this way. So I think it is time D.C. needs to become a part of Maryland once again. Maryland should have an extra Congress people. We should vote for Maryland senators. That's what has to happen.
Or else just give it to Jack Kemp.
Okay, that's fine.
You mentioned the economist, Mr. Kahn, and I wanted to just show you something in the Wall Street Journal this morning. They report on the front page that last week Senator Dole brought together a group of economists into his office on Capitol Hill to help him craft his economic strategy, his approach to the economy, his campaign. I want to read you the list of the names and see if you can help us understand the kind of people he's bringing in and where he might be going. These economists, this is in a box in the Wall Street Journal, met with Senator Dole. Gary Becker, Nobel Prize winner of the University of Chicago, Robert Barrow of Harvard, Martin Feldstein, former Reagan economic advisor, also at Harvard, John Taylor, former Bush economic advisor, now at Stanford, John Lipsky of Salomon Brothers, and Charles Wolf of Rand. Can you discern anything?
I don't know them all. I know three or four. It seems to me that they are by and large market oriented, but people who've had experience attempting to bridge the problems between economic theory and political reality. Sounds like an okay list. No screwball there.
There's one who, in my judgment, is a screwball on this list, but probably for reasons of tact. I'll tell you when the program is over.
Oh, you can't do that to us.
Well, I'll say instead that I think that Gary Becker and Martin Feldstein, these certainly are distinguished and mainstream Republican-type characters.
All right, now go the others, and we'll process of elimination.
Your lady, Susan, what's her name? The head economic woman for...
Laura Tyson,
Laura Tyson. What?
Laura Tyson?
Laura Tyson, yeah. Milton Friedman said to me, when her name was, they say, you know, I know everybody. I never heard of her before.
Well, I actually had heard of her. I was glad that she got this job, but maybe that's why he's a Nobel laureate and I'm a journalist.
No, I mean, maybe she's terrific, but I guess she wasn't very conspicuous on the academic scene.
It was in one particular field, sort of the trade policy, which I think that Milton Friedman, on principle, doesn't pay attention to because he realizes he thinks it's all illegitimate.
What seems to be coming out, based on Alan Mary's story from this, is a drive to understand which taxes Senator Dole will propose to cut. Would you take the idea generally of tax cutting as a position for his presidential campaign?
Oh, absolutely. People have an inchoate sense that the burden on life is over heavy. And they're sick and tired of the particularizations, which always ends up in energizing a set of lobbies. Says, if you push that button, you'll never be able to see the Statue of Liberty again. So they just want tax cuts and let other people figure out exactly how to do it. Let the congressman whose job it is to do it. It'd be marvelous to simply say, okay, you gotta cut it by 3% of the load next year, and go ahead and let them do it. But meanwhile, in my judgment, the Republican Party has nothing really genuinely to offer if it hasn't captured that insight that a tax cut is required.
And this, of course, is a difficult thing for Mr. Dole in particular to do because his whole legislative life has been not that of the tax cut ideologue, but somebody crafting all these careful, moderate agreements as time has gone on. So it's a...
Did you say ideologue?
No, the tax cut theorist. I'll put it that way. So I think that is the message for the Republicans, but he's an imperfect vessel for conveying that message.
So let's go to the audience and get them involved in the discussion. First is Costa Mesa, California.
Yes, thank you very much, Susan. C-SPAN's a great program, and it's pretty much saved my life because it's the most informed way I have other than other network programs to get general information of an unbiased nature. What I want to talk about and ask the two gentlemen about is why it seems to be so much emphasis is put on President Clinton and the S&L crisis as the same was put on George Bush's son. And if this S&L crisis has cost us almost 1/5 of our national debt, and it has been so spoke of so little on either floor of the Congress, if not by either president of either party, to have such an effect on our country to not be spoke of by either side makes me feel that something really is going on in collusion of both parties, which is, I know, completely absurd, because how would both parties be in collusion of something that they don't speak about?
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think this was a failure as much of journalism as of politics. About 10 years ago, when the SNL crisis was beginning to burble up, I think many journalists thought this is just too complicated to explain. And it was the classic Migo story, my eyes glaze over story, and so it wasn't really written about. And the difficulty with it is that it's very hard to find villains on a scale comparable with the cost. It's all these kind of pathetic small-time villains like the McDougalls in Arkansas. So I think it is a matter of it doesn't fit the normal dramatic structure that we have for political discussion, and neither party has an answer to it. So I think that's why it's been just absorbed as this friction in the system rather than raised as a political issue.
Well, intending no partisan opportunism here, it does seem to me that Mr. Reagan was responsible in his role as overseer for not having dramatized the impending danger. But there were two things that prompted the collapse of the SNLs. Number one was pulling out that Regulation G that said that they couldn't pay whatever interest was necessary to borrow money. Second was extending protection from $3,000 in fact to infinity, formally to $100,000. Changed the whole character of the SNL scene, and it was, as I say, it was the Republicans' fault for not detecting it. But all what I have just finished saying was done by Democrats who control Congress.
Well, but it's significantly, they were not divisive issues when they happened. I think that's what makes the SNL crisis a really interesting issue, because it's something where if there's a villain, it's basically everyone, because everyone wanted to have higher interest rates in the deposits they put, and everybody wanted to have their deposits insured. And so it was the classic. If we look for villains, it's the whole society that wanted more security, wanted the market, the rewards of the market, but not the risks.
Our next question comes from Shreveport. Good morning.
Good morning. How are you doing this morning?
Fine, sir.
I really enjoy C-SPAN. I appreciate your program. We get a little unbiased information here. The question I had is, you know, in each and every case with the debt, it seems to me like they get overcomplicated with trying to solve the problem. Why can't they just come in, cut a flat 5 or 10% off the top of everything, then everybody's happy? It's like we've gone to a competitive nature. Either the Republicans win or the Democrats win, and the American people lose.
Well, I like the idea of saying, okay, we're going to reduce expenses by 10%. In point of fact, you can't do that, because let's say a countdown system for an orbital missile, you can't cut out the money that keeps them from counting 10, 9, 8, 7. So that kind of thing doesn't work too sharply. The idea, I think, is extremely useful to reduce expenditures and then spend the time allocating, as between this and that, what has fat in it.
No, I agree, and I think that almost everyone would agree with the caller that if you could do this, it would be simpler and cleaner. But for example, something like now 20% of the federal budget is interest payments, which you cannot legally reduce at all. I don't know the exact number, but it's in that dimension. Defense, to cut 10% out of that, many people might resist it. Social Security and Medicare, you know, they are a very large share of the budget, and there's a very great political resistance to cutting them. And so it makes intellectual sense.
Yeah, but that's a bad example, though, because I think one could cut Social Security.
I would be in favor of this. I'm just saying politically it seems impossible.
Yeah. Why there hasn't been indexation of Social Security is just one of those anti-intellectual insights about things that obviously should be done. People are living 8 years longer than they were in Bismarck set the age of 65 for retirement when the Germans' life expectancy was 47.
Is that where it came from? Has it sort of been the tradition?
I'm sure that's true, because Lester Thoreau told me that a week ago.
It must be true.
Next is Homeland, California. Good morning, caller.
Hello.
Go ahead, please.
How are you?
Fine, sir.
I'd just like to make a statement on the question of metal fatigue. I have an old 68 Dodge truck, and I had an 86 Peterbilt truck at one time. And both of these had approximately 300,000 to 500,000 miles on the vehicles, and they were fatigued, and I had to put new inserts into the frame itself to maintain the stability.
Well, how's this help us understand the airline question?
Well, I do believe a vehicle at 20. Well, I use the old airplane, the A-26. If you're familiar with that, it was a World War II dive bomber, which they had to rebuild in Vietnam, which I am a Vietnam veteran. And it was known as the B-26. And the reason they rebuilt that plane was because the frame itself, the frame itself fatigued. I mean, it was, those A-26s were about ready just to collapse where they were sitting. So they built a B-26 and did away with some of the plexiglass and the bombardier sight in the nose of the plane and put, I believe, 8 machine guns and, modernize the plane itself.
Okay, sir. Thanks. Appreciate your insight on how this whole airline safety question works.
I think that probably the two of us don't want to get too deeply into an issue in which neither of us is expert. I think something that
metallurgy was my minor at school.
Well, let me add a perspective from a faxer on this question from a gentleman from Sandwich, New Hampshire, who says, while the feds have something to do with the safety of planes, it is clear to me that our planes are safe because of the people who fly and maintain them. The impression is left by the feds that we could not do this without them. I would submit that insurance rates do more than the feds. FAA, if you like.
I guess with respect to the viewer, I would disagree, because I take it as granted that everybody in this business is honorable and doing his or her best in inspecting the planes and flying the planes. But if you're operating in a business, you need to cut costs as much as you can, and the limit on how far you'll cut them is the regulations, where you say you're going to have inspections every so often, you're going to have the engines overhauled after so many hours of flight, and so I think that is where it's the interaction of what the government requires in terms of repeated inspections. I think the point about metal fatigue is, I understand with aircraft, it's not a straight line function where each hour you become a little more fatigued. It's a sort of discontinuity where after a certain point the metal may suddenly give, and so that's the need for these inspections.
Yeah, and also the notion that insurance company can enforce standards bumps up into anomalies. It was widely discussed, for instance, that was it the Ford Motor Company, somebody was counseled not to fix a particular thing that showed a vulnerability every 1,000,000 miles on the grounds it was cheaper to go ahead and pay for it and not make the revision. Now, whether or not that anomaly would present itself with airplanes, i.e., okay, do a 99% of inspection on the grounds that the 1% you don't do is only going to be just one crash a year, and that's what's one crash a year when you can save $20 million, $100 million, I don't know. So it has to be a little bit more rigid than simply a free market process. How you like that conception?
Oh, boy.
Write that down.
My life is complete.
Smyrna, Georgia is next. Good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
Fine, sir.
Can I ask a question of the two gentlemen?
Absolutely. That's what it's all about.
Okay. Do either one of you have somebody on your staff who could crunch out numbers on health care?
Not on the staff of the magazine. I know who I would call in the various branches of the government. And so what sort of number are you looking for?
Well, here's what I would suggest. You know, you talked about cutting off a certain amount of money. I'll tell you how you could cut 20% off Medicare without affecting Medicare and 50% off Medicaid without changing the coverage on Medicaid.
Well, hurry up.
If you take any one of the health care programs that were discussed in 1994 and evaluate the total cost for health care to cover everybody in the country, instead of spending $1 trillion, you'd spend $545 billion. And the way you cut 20% off Medicare is if everybody is covered, there's no cost shifting in the system then, and there's 20% cost shifting built into Medicare right now. And Medicaid, they're spending as much per person on Medicaid as they spend per person on Medicare, which means the young people are being charged something on the order of $5,000 per person per year on Medicaid, where if they were covered by a good health insurance program, it would be $2,000.
Thanks.
So I would suggest that you get somebody who can crunch out numbers and go back through those numbers.
Let's start with Mr. Buckley on this, if we could.
Well, I'm not familiar with those that particular slant.
But the point is universal coverage saves costs, is his point.
Well, we we have to go back to ABC. You want to do that?
Sure. If it doesn't take too long.
The thing you want to eliminate is unnecessary medical expenses. How do you eliminate those? You reward people who look for the cheapest way to handle something. I published a letter from a doctor a couple of years ago, said in Houston, if you're told to get a particular blood test, you can get it for $15 on up to $85, depending on where you go. There is zero pressure on the average person who has a policy to search out the $15 place. Now, that's the kind of thing that the IRAs, in my judgment, would home in on, and that's the way I think that principal saving ought to be approached.
Right, and I certainly agree that's a big part of saving. I think what the caller also is talking about is de facto, we do have universal coverage. If somebody gets shot, if somebody is dying of tuberculosis, they get hauled into the hospital and they get treated in a very inefficient and costly way, which all of us who have insurance end up paying for. And so his argument was if you have universal coverage, you have a more efficient way of treating these systems than we have now. And I would agree with that. But also, of course, these incentives have to be built in, as you're saying.
Next is Enid, Oklahoma.
Good morning. Mr. Buckley, longtime fan. Like it or not, I think this race will be, and I wanted to get your opinion, whether this race will be won on appearances. I think there will be the usual party rhetoric, but in the end, I kind of feel that the candidate's appearances is going to be the up or down on this. And I wanted to get your comment on something else. On the Medicare issue, what about just having more doctors? I mean, for a long time, the AMA lobby, there's just a certain amount of doctors that come out of schools every year. What about just having more doctors available to cut costs? Thank you.
Well, the most recent figures on that subject, if memory serves, is that there are too many doctors who are not actually employing their skills. I know a doctor who moved from my town to California 15 years ago on the ground that he was not being used sufficiently as a doctor. He was simply executing forms. So he wanted to go to an outfit where other people execute forms, and he'd find out what made people sick. So the idea of more doctors is not an automatic answer to the problem. There really isn't a scarcity of medical care, except in individual places where doctors don't want to go. I don't think anybody really says that the proportion of doctors to people is insufficient. Am I right?
That's right. And certainly what the caller says was true. I think a generation or two ago there was a kind of artificial limit on the supply of doctors. But now you have an economic anomaly. In most products, if you have a greater supply, the price goes down. If you have a greater supply of doctors, spending on medical care tends to go up because there's more things to treat, more procedures to do, more specialties, etc.
Plantation, Florida. Good morning.
Yes. Thank you for C-SPAN. I wanted to address Mr. Barrow's remarks about ValueJet earlier in the program. First of all, it was only being audited because of its rapid expansion, and there had not been any complaints or problems as far as notification to the FAA were concerned. Secondly, an aircraft, when it's built, is estimated to have a certain number of cycles in its lifetime, which in the particular case of the DC-9, I believe, was 110,000, and this one had approximately 80.
The cycle is landing and taking off.
And an aircraft with proper maintenance throughout its history is a safe airplane, whether it's old or not. Now, I'm a former pilot, and I was always a great believer, and I wanted to get to where I was going every bit as badly as every passenger that rode behind me. So I think people, not just you in this particular comment, but the newspapers as well, are jumping on an airline with no facts. Yesterday I saw something in the paper of what can we do to prevent this type of accident when they don't even have any suggestion at the moment as to what caused this plane to go down.
I should be careful about what I was saying. I was not presenting myself, number one, as an aviation expert, or number two, as somebody who has any particular insight into ValueJet. I was saying, as a consumer, I had decided a year or two ago that I didn't prefer to save money by flying on this plane because it gave me a feeling I'd had on other airlines that were saving money in ways that you know, I was exercising my consumer choice. So again, I don't know what happened in this incident, but on saying there was nothing with ValueJet, I understand there was a case in which one of their planes had a fire on the runway, I guess last year, and several overshooting the runways recently. Whether this is above the norm for the industry, I'm not sure, but I think it was anyhow, that was my own consumer choice.
Yeah, it's interesting. This is an analog of the broken window school of crime. If you let a window stay broken, the next thing you know, it causes crime because people think of it as an unpoliced area. By the same token, if you go on an airline and they don't give you a hot dog at lunch, you think, well, there are perhaps proportional savings being done when they check the fuel supply or whatever. But that is unsafe, isn't it, that correlation? So therefore, your intuition against flying value debt wasn't because...
It was not because I didn't like the food. I mean, Northwest Airlines, for example, 20 years ago, their reputation was having bad in-flight service and the prideful mechanics of Minnesota or whatever who are working them over. So I'm not saying that a good meal is equal to a good engine. I'm saying that I decided, I'm just passing this along anecdotally, that I didn't want to fly on this route.
About 20 minutes left with our guest. Fox Island, Washington is next. Good morning.
Yes, good morning. Mr. Buckley, you've been a favorite of mine ever since you hired John Coyne, one of my graduates, when I was dean of the University of Alaska. Now, the other thing is, I'm also an expendable. I started into combat in New Guinea, the first offensive campaign against the enemy in the Pacific, as an expendable. I started out as a first sergeant of 214 men, and I had 46 men left. There are two questions. We're talking about defense. We're talking about all of these trials that the president is facing. I'd like to know what your attitude is about why aren't now and some of the other organizations railing against Clinton as they've railed against other people. And I'd also like to know why they are not letting us, don't want us to get into the missile age, because we were fighting with World War I weapons during in New Guinea. We didn't even have uniforms. We dyed them up green in Australia. I'd like to get your views on why now and the others aren't there, and what about...
Well, certainly on the Second World War, it was a national scandal. They ran out even of rifles in the early 30s and were using broomsticks in one famous recollection. Going forward, I couldn't agree with you more that it is a mistake not to develop the anti-missile technology, and this is a great, very important lacuna in the democratic strategic vision. In between, I think one should always attempt, where defense is involved, to be sort of super safe. I remember Burt Law, the comedian, when he died, he said he was going to leave much of all of his money toward a factory that would construct 11-foot sticks for people who had sticks who had 10-foot sticks that wouldn't reach the objective. Using that principle, I think it's correct to overspend to the point where you have a feeling of safety.
Without getting into this missile defense argument, I wanted to mention one other thing to the caller. I've just read the manuscript of a terrific new book which involves the fighting in New Guinea and the Solomons. It's called My Father's War, by a man named Peter Richmond, whose father actually was part of this combat, and it is just gripping, and so I can't recommend it highly enough. It'll be out, I think, in a month or two.
During our very first portion of our program this morning, we had 2 telephone calls on the abortion debate and politics. Your column in the most current issue of the National Review, the lead item is about abortion. And in addition to that, you close in this way: we are coming quickly on a derivative philosophical question which will require keen eyesight for close examination. It is, of course, euthanasia. Papers this morning have Dr. Kevorkian. Your comments, please, and Mr. Fallis as well, about our societal and political debate on these issues.
Well, my philosophical argument is this. People who are indifferent, who are indifferent to the fate of the fetus, insist that there really are only 2 parties, the husband and the mother, and predominantly the mother. Those who argue the pro-life argument say, no, there are 3 people involved, 3 figures, and they keep insisting that the fetus is something other than a tomato, and under the circumstances make derivative arguments. But now when you get to euthanasia, it becomes the problem involving a single human being. You can't be told that if you end your life, it is my responsibility or that of Jim Fallows. Under the circumstances, the there will be, I think, a predictable ease with which an extension of Roe v. Wade thinking is going to insist that there is a right constitutionally vested to for you to take your life, and if so, derivatively, to get somebody to make it easier for you to do so.
I actually agree with what you were saying. My magazine had a cover story 3 or 4 months ago analogizing the abortion issue to the politics of slavery. And the argument it was making was not that we're going to have another civil war, but saying that the ethical interests were as intractably opposed as they were in the slavery debate. And my guess is that there will be no intellectual resolution to the abortion issue. I think it's impossible to resolve. It'll be the same uneasy and unsatisfactory compromise we've had since Roe v. Wade, with people deeply feeling this is a wrong policy, but politically being unable to change it.
Why might this not change 50 years from now?
Anything is possible, but I think there is the political inertia is such that the minority of the population, which feels this is deeply offensive in a way like the slavery or the Holocaust, I think it is impossible for them to overcome the political inertia on the other side. Next is
South Dansville, New York. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for C-SPAN. I'd like probably Mr. Fellows to address this, since he commented on D.C. and I guess starting to feel like he's in the third world. The thing that drives me crazy and may lead me to join a militia before it's over, when I hear him talk about social welfare expenditures, they say that for $1, 28 cents ends up in the hand of the recipient, the person to be helped. When we look at a country where a majority of the families have 2 people working, where in New York State where I live, the tax burden probably with the sales tax and the property tax and the state and federal income tax is 50%, how can this be? Where does that 72 cents go? How can we allow that to happen? And doesn't it tell us that government is just inherently extremely inefficient?
I guess I would look further into where that figure comes from. For example, in Social Security, which is the largest transfer payment, that cannot be true. I mean, there are some administrative costs, but they can't be that large. Medicare is the next largest transfer payment, and there are certainly costs there for administration and for hospital overhead and things like that. It is possible that this figure comes only from strict AFDC, welfare in the classic sense, and there I suppose it goes probably for caseworkers to make sure that people aren't being cheated. So I'm not willing to say that this figure sounds suspicious to me on its face, but is government inefficient? Yes, it can be. Many parts of it are. It needs to work better. Some parts of it work well. I think that this, however, is not the fundamental problem of D.C. The fundamental problem of D.C. is that it is it's like a neck operating without its body, as if New York City turned into a state without the power to tax any of its resources. D.C. cannot tax the incomes of most people who work here because they live in D.C. or Maryland, and it can't tax most of the property in the city. So it's just unsustainable in the long run.
Well, on the general point, I think that the caller is correct when he uses the word inherently about a government cost. It has really to do with the fact that other than economic considerations receive priority. Now, this is as easy to establish as that from coast to coast. In every single situation where an enterprise has been privatized, it's become cheaper. The cost of removing garbage in San Francisco went down 40%. So those are symbolic but instructive figures.
But by definition, if it had been a purely market function, the market would have been doing it. And the reason so it's not surprising that things become cheaper when done by the private market, because that was why the government was brought in for some sort of market failure correction.
To put your mother-in-law on the payroll?
Well, in some cases, yes, of course. And so I would never, I've written dozens of articles saying here's how the government wastes money, but there are certain functions where the market doesn't wholly encompass the equities there. For example, inspecting airlines for safety. It would be cheaper to run airlines with no safety inspections, but this is where the inefficiency of the government may be necessary for the general welfare.
Well, the government undertakes to protect life, liberty, and property, and therefore I think where the job cannot be undertaken reliably by somebody else, they have to have a function. But I don't believe for a minute that people wouldn't voluntarily subscribe to a code that gives it the responsibility, in part because sometimes it involves egregious expenditures, even when a subject of minor economic interest is involved. You'll have the whole Army and Navy go out to save one person who's lost in the middle of the Atlantic, and I think that's as it should be.
Next is Longmont, Colorado. Good morning.
Good morning. This is a question for Mr. Buckley. I'd like to know if he could tell me what has happened with the drug decriminalization issue. You know, I had seen him on a public forum before, and I'd just like to know if his views have changed on decriminalizing, you know, taking the money out of it, which I believe taking the money and the profit out of the drug will, which I believe will solve the problem, instead of throwing more money at police and more money at prisons.
Well, I agree with you. I agree. I edited and wrote for a special issue of National Review that made that point. We've gotten a huge amount of mail, which we haven't even organized to comment on. But let me say, after 15 years of thinking about the subject, the principal difficulty in making progress is that people are convinced that drug consumption is evil. I happen to agree with them in most cases. So therefore they say, why should we authorize evil? Now you may say this is awfully primitive thinking, and I think it's primitive in a way too. However, I think that is what causes the overwhelming majority of the American people simply to resist spasmodically any suggestion of licensing drugs.
I agree entirely with you with the solution you propose, and also your analysis of what the resistance is. And I think maybe the way to shift the debate is to say that the most effective way to discourage this evil is to take the money out of it and simultaneously to discourage people from using drugs, but to act as if the way to do that is not, you know, sending them away for 20 years in the pen. So I think that dual message is the way to get it across.
Durham, North Carolina.
Yes. I had a question primarily for Mr. Buckley. I read a piece that he wrote back in the mid-'60s that was entitled The Politics of Beauty, and it was talking primarily about Lady Bird Johnson's scenic beauty campaigns, and I was interested in finding out how he feels we have progressed since that time. I think we have made a lot of progress in historic preservation and other areas, but at the same time the billboards seem to be bigger than ever, and in a lot of ways our highways are uglier than ever, and I was just interested in any comments he might have on that subject.
Well, I think that what was attempted, namely to deny to an offending state the subsidy it would otherwise have gotten if they permitted billboards, was weighed as an economic question by a lot of states, and a lot of states said, okay, we'll go along, we'll get that extra 5% of federal funds. Others would say, no, we'll yield we'll give you the 5% because we're going to get 10% the equivalent from commercial use. The principal point I tried to make in that is that philosophically, private property ought not to include your right to tell me across the street where I live that Coca-Cola is the drink that refreshes. If you want to have a billboard facing in towards your own house, that I think is philosophically okay, and that's the notion I tried to propagate, that it is an act of aggression to accost you in a public road with anything that doesn't have to do with where are the nearest facilities or what is the nearest weather report.
And I think we see here the difference between a conservative, which Mr. Buckley is, and a free market nut, because of course a free market nut will say that anything the market produces is good, and we recognize conservatives and liberals alike, there's a certain fabric of society which can be frayed if too many things authorized by the market go ahead.
Let me show you the covers of our guest magazines, the most recent editions. And the National Review has what it is calling the special collapse issue. Grin and bear it, a lighthearted look at the coming market crash. Also a story with Republicans like these, who needs Democrats. And the current issue of the Atlantic Monthly. Social insecurity. Unless we act now, the aging of America will become an economic problem that dwarfs all other national issues. Bob Samuelson has a column saying virtually the same thing, and says that Senator Dole has an opportunity to take center stage by moving that issue forward. He writes, everyone talks of balancing the budget and reducing the government without mentioning spending for older Americans, which is the decisive issue affecting the budget and government size. Only Bob Dole can compel this critical issue, and he should.
I agree, and this would be a way that the politics for Bob Dole trying to get attention would match, political service or policy service to the country. It's a subject we all want to avoid because we don't like to think about getting older ourselves, et cetera. But I think that it is, as we try to argue in this issue of the magazine, it is the main physical issue we confront. And just to spell it out for some of your viewers, the main driving force in federal spending is, of course, pensions for people who are older but not otherwise in need through Social Security and Medicare. And so if we need to, that's... Yes, we have a yes.
I do have a news clip. You want to comment on that? It'll hold a second.
Fine.
Okay. All morning long, we've been looking at these front page stories about Senator Dole's press conference, which he was going to step aside as majority leader. NBC has just reported, and it's on the wire, that Senate Majority Leader Bob Dole will resign from the Senate.
Well, that's a wise choice. I think it shows he's taking this race seriously. I think he's. I think it's a public-spirited choice.
Well, I think it's public-spirited, but I wonder at the politics of it, because how frequently will the cameras be there to listen to him under the circumstances?
Well,
it's so heliocentric. The White House or a government official, somebody who's going to vote the next day, attracts 99% of the attention. Is the mere fact that he's a contender, even though he hasn't even been crowned yet, going to be enough so that when he calls a press conference, everybody will be there?
Yeah, I think there is the structure built in that you have the presidential candidates, and so he'll get his daily minute and a half or whatever. And the minute and a half he's getting now, he's usually cloistered in the Senate chambers and in images that maybe he thought were destructive to him. So.
In a further update, the network cites unnamed sources as saying Dole wants to make a clean break from the Senate and spend all his time on the presidential race.
That's okay by me.
Yeah.
You got any problems with that?
No, we find concord once again.
Scottsdale, Arizona, good morning.
Hi. I really enjoy C-SPAN. I wanted to ask a question. I had heard that Clinton was sending 14,000 troops into Atlanta for the Olympics.
13,000 what?
Troops into Atlanta for security and other issues on the Olympics.
It sounded like it was for menial work more than anything else, driving the athletes around and doing cleanup, et cetera, et cetera. This is quite a bit more than even was sent into Haiti. And if this is true, I can't understand why this isn't a huge, gigantic story. Thank you.
I guess I would agree. If it's true, it'd be surprising that's not a story. So I guess it raises the question of whether it's true or not. And can you tell us more about where you heard this?
Are you still there?
Yes. I can't remember where I heard it, but it was a blurb.
Actually, we talked about it in a program at the table last week. I cannot tell you whether or not the 15,000 number is right, but I remember the discussion at the table of the story. They are doing security, and then some portion were being deployed to some things like logistics, which would include
the National Guard
trucks.
or the actual Army.
I can't tell you.
It's big, important. Very different, because if it's troops, they've got to be somewhere, right? So it might be where they can be useful. To the extent that they are logistically useful, I think one can wink one's eyes at the transgression of that kind of issue. I mean, you and I are naturally permissive anyway.
Yes, that's right.
We've gotten a lot of faxes in this morning, some about the value jet and leg. We've gotten a number about you, and one, Mr. Buckley, that wants to know why you never ran for elective office.
I did.
Oh, au contraire.
Yeah, I ran for mayor, so I did my jury duty. But I think one reaches a point more in America than in England, and at which somebody who's politically engaged decides to become a critic or an activist. And in his case and in mine, we decided to go in one particular direction. It's very hard to do both, because concessions are required. In England, you get a safe seat, and you know you can be re-elected as long as you want, so you can go write your books, no matter how provocative they are, and still have an active political career. You can't do that here. That's why so few people write books in Congress. Who besides Moynihan has written a book in the last 10 years?
Actually, quite a number of people have written books, including novels. Increasing number of novels being written by members of the House and the Senate.
Or for them. Yeah.
So Sioux Falls, South Dakota, good morning.
Good morning, C-SPAN. Just a comment pertaining to the savings and loan problems that we faced. I think they missed part of the point, or part of the problem, I think, was caused by the 86 tax simplification code that took out the passive activity loss, or brought in passive activity losses, and a lot of people invested in property that was really overvalued based on current tax laws, and I think that was a big part of the, if not the biggest part of the savings and loans crisis. I'd like to see if they comment on that, please.
Can you take that?
Yes, I would agree with that. It was a question of a change in the '86 tax law that which encouraged more speculation. And I think you had this kind of strange child of capitalism where people were being encouraged by various tax code provisions to take more risks and also get higher returns on their S&L accounts, but also to be guaranteed to be immunized against the consequences. And so the combination of deposit guarantee and encouragement of speculation led, I think, to the S&L problem.
We have about 2 minutes left. What's another story you flagged and we didn't get to?
Oh, I had actually from the sports page several questions of redemption and downfall. You have Dwight Gooden after his drug problems pitching a no-hitter. You have Favre, or however he says it, of Green Bay going to drug rehab, and you have Magic Johnson retiring from basketball. I think these show both the drama of sport, but also it brings us back to this drug issue we're talking about before.
O.J. retiring from crime.
That's right. O.J. going to England. Maybe he won't be let back into our nation. I think that this. If you have people who make as much money as these athletes do and as much stake in their bodies who still are getting involved in drugs, it shows that some other approach than the one we have now is necessary to cope with this.
It's just about 10 o'clock, and we had been told that the House was going to be coming into session. Because that little section lasted longer, they're going to start at 10:10. Can both of you stay for 10 more minutes?
My busy schedule will permit this extra 10 minutes, yes.
Mr. Buckley as well?
Sure.
Great. Let's go to Covello, California next. Good morning.
Hello. I have a question for both of your gentlemen, especially Mr. Fallows, who is, I know, an excellent writer on media and stuff. How do you feel about television in this upcoming election? Do you think it will give us a good picture of what's going on and an ability to make a decision? And do you have any suggestions on how we can perhaps give it a good direction in that way?
Well, on the big question, will it do a good job? Probably not, I would say. But I think there's been actually an important step for the public welfare with the decision, I think now, of all the networks to agree to give some free airtime to the candidates. This was a campaign that Paul Taylor, formerly of the Washington Post, and Walter Cronkite were heading up, and they had the sensible idea that it could do no harm and maybe would do some good to have the candidates make their appeal directly to the viewers and the voters in network time. It reduces the burden of raising money. It gives them a
up until about 15 years ago, or whatever, 12 years ago, when you went on the Today Show, you went for 15 minutes, and you could say something. Ken Galbraith and I analyzed 2 conventions on ABC, or NBC, I guess it was. Then, beginning in Kansas City, we were shrunk from 15 minutes to 6 or 7 minutes, which meant that all you could do was sort of gouge and punch, and it ended up simply destroying any possibility of the communication. They had me on the Today Show a couple months ago on the drug question, opposite the head of the drug, whoever he was in January, his predecessor.
Mr. McCaffrey.
And so then we had 6.5 minutes in which I would say something, he would barrel in with his. Afterwards, though, I said to the producer, why didn't you just put me on 6 minutes and give him 6 hours for all I care? But let's get something said. The kind of nervousness you feel in the camera if they allow a Dole or a Clinton to go beyond. Well, Clinton, there's special immunities for a president, but to go more than simply a bite sound is so aggravating because it robs any story of texture, of complexity, of subtleties. Now, they might say, well, that's the audience's fault. The audience gets twitchy. Well, McNeil Lehrer have managed to keep their attention, haven't they, even though they don't do that. Now, maybe their ratings are too slow. Do you have a comment on that?
Well, let me just throw into it the Pew study, because we talked with Andy Kohut, whose results got lots of coverage, which said that fewer and fewer people are using the news anyway as their source for political.
The justification given by most of the networks for shrinking the sound bites every single year, again, it was 7 seconds during this last Republican campaign, the average sound bite. They say, well, we have to do this to keep the audience. If that's the rationale, it's not a good enough one because it's not working. What they're doing now is not holding an audience, and so I think they should be emboldened to say, let's try some different approach. Let's try doing it 20 seconds. Let's try giving people a better sense of how the world works, because it can't be less effective on the market than what they're doing now.
Did you like the free TV idea?
Yes. You should be an expert on the subject.
But I don't comment at the table.
Oh, you don't? Okay. After so, you can tell us what you think.
But let me ask you about the whole concept of networks giving free TV. Do you like that?
Well, yeah, yes. I think networks should be paying for the time. They auction stations. I say this as a former station owner too. Stations should be auctioned There is a concomitant obligation that goes with using and I think all that's got to be anachronized because there's technology that's floating in. But meanwhile, I've got no problem with that at all.
St. Petersburg, Florida. Good morning.
Good morning. This is my first time calling.
Welcome.
And I do watch your program and really enjoy it. I just have a comment to make about this plane wreck, or at least my feelings about the wreck down here. There's a lot of finger pointing. My thought is the government really has to own up to the responsibility in a couple of ways. The main way is, I think, overtaxation of businesses is a big problem. As a small business owner myself, and my husband also has his own business, we really feel the burden of the taxation.
How many employees do you have?
We both have, I have 3 and he has 3.
And what kind of business do you run?
I have a small retirement home for elderly, and my husband has a small manufacturing company.
Thanks very much. Mr. Buckley, overtaxation of small business.
Well, I think there's overtaxation around the board. Whether the caller tends to distinguish small business from
she did
other
say
kind of
business.
business.
I said small. It was my fault. She said overtaxation of business.
Well, yeah. In a book I wrote in 1970 called Four Reforms, I came out in favor of abolishing the business tax altogether. In the first place, there's double taxation. In the second place, it encourages a sort of an auto-hypnosis that the consumer is not really paying for this huge amount of tax. Whatever the tax is, it oughtn't to come in stages through various discrete enterprises or trunks.
I would try to help small businesses by abolishing the payroll tax, which has an anti-job effect and weighs disproportionately hard on small businesses and lower wage people. And I would shift to some kind of energy tax as opposed to a payroll tax. That's the swap I would have.
We have questions for you by fax and by email. This is for you, Mr. Fallows, about your book. I enjoyed your book on the media. Was wondering whether Nightline has expressed interest in it and might do a viewpoint in which it used to do with prominent journalists on a topic. If not, why not, do you suppose?
This book is called Breaking the News. Nightline has not done this. I would be happy if they were to do it. Let me tell you what I think the real reason is. I several times mentioned Nightline in a complimentary way in this book, and so I think they're afraid of being seen to be carrying water. Yes. So if I had been tougher on them, maybe I would have had this show.
There's one here for you, Mr. Buckley. Many people feel that the main reason for the deterioration of the inner cities is due to people living there doing nothing but sitting around and collecting welfare and food stamps. Do you have any statistics to indicate what percentages of inner city residents work versus welfare?
I don't have the statistics. They're easily available. Something like 14, 15, 16% of the people in New York City receive welfare. I do think this, so that we ought to ask ourselves, why is the inner city so dirty? Given the fact that everybody concedes there are a lot of people there doing nothing because they are unemployed, what is it that is missing in the ethos of America that makes rubbish, for instance, in Switzerland, in most places, simply something we wouldn't tolerate? We wouldn't tolerate being hungry because we have a biological requirement to eat. Or wouldn't it be nice if we had a visual or aesthetic requirement not to drop things in the middle of the street? Now, our failure to communicate that is a real important national problem, and not one, in my judgment, that can be accosted by government.
Mr. Fellows, this viewer goes on to write, also there are cities in this country that have not spent a dime in inner city areas in 30 to 40 years. These inner city residents are also taxpayers, yet they have the worst schools, services, libraries, parks, etc.
I agree, and I think that the great economic problem of America, I think, is not so much piracy from China or whatever. It's the sort of growing inequality in various ways within our country. And the schools, something has to be done about them, because the children who need the most help from schools have the worst schools to deal with. And whether the answer is vouchers, whether it's some kind of district funding, something needs to be done to give children whose fault it is not that their parents are poor a better chance early in life at schools.
Don't hit and run on vouchers. I mean, vouchers is the obvious solution. If they don't work, then we go somewhere else. But meanwhile, we keep turning down vouchers, thanks to the Democratic establishment and the unions, the teachers' unions.
The case I would make for vouchers is for, say, for parents who are very poor, poor. I'd be happy to support vouchers for them. I think the other obvious solution is some kind of equality of district funding, where the kids who come from the wealthiest families have the best schools to go to, and we don't, the district by district school funding system is something that no other country practices. They view education as a more national system to distribute, and so I think this is the other area to look.
Farmington, Missouri, about a minute and a half left in our program. Good morning.
Good morning. I'm calling to say that I'd like to see some more of Ralph Nader, see him be able to express some more of his views publicly. I think he's an honest person. I think he's a trustworthy person, which is sort of a novel feeling, right, when I think about the other candidates for president.
And I was going to say, and also running for president this year on the Green Party ticket.
Right, yeah.
You have any thoughts on Mr. Nader's candidacy?
Oh, well, it's essentially frivolous. He is a man who's driven by his own ideas. They take odd turns every now and then, as on the NAFTA issue, for instance. He certainly can be a figure in California. If he gets 7%, that almost certainly would cost Clinton the state. But this sort of green business we have from time to time. Who was it 8 years ago up in Wisconsin who ran? Well, they don't get much of the vote because there isn't really a sense that the responsibilities they call attention to aren't accosted by one of the major parties.
Ralph Nader is actually a former employer of mine. I worked for him when I was in college, and after that, he's somebody I like very much and respect very much. I think I'm sorry that he's running for president, but I think what I respect tremendously in his message is not the idea that you have to beat up on big companies or whatever, but that people should be actively involved in the management of their society, and that citizens should be mobilized, and I think that's a good message on which we might even agree.
Is it clear to you at this point on what issues that the presidential campaign this year will be campaigned and won on?
No. It's not. It seems to me that what tends to be disappearing from the place it once held in the public interrogatory is the question of character. People seem much less now than a year or 2 years ago to say Clinton has a problem at that level, which we will consider. 30% of the Democrats polled 5 years ago said they wouldn't vote for Mr. Clinton if it were established that he committed adultery. Now, I think that's gone.
But I think that's not really surprising, because Clinton, whether you like him or dislike him, is a known figure now. Yeah. People are either they like his policies or not, making allowances for his personality. And so I guess I fear that the main axis of this campaign is going to be Clinton implying or saying directly that Bob Dole is too old and too out of it, and Dole saying Clinton is just too bad as a character, because I don't think there'll be issues more than that which are joined.
Yeah. Sorry about that.
The House of Representatives has just come into session, so at this point we will say thanks to our two guests at the table, William F. Buckley, editor-at-large of the National Review. You can read his column each issue?
In each of my issues, yeah.
And what does that mean?
Well, I thought you meant maybe in newspapers. It's twice a week. My column is twice a week.
All right. And James Fallows, who is a Washington editor in the Atlantic Monthly, not in there this month because of your book tour, but we'll look for you next month. Thanks for being at the table.
House Calendar number 150, House Resolution 303, resolved that at any time after the adoption of this resolution, the Speaker may, pursuant to Clause 1B of Rule 23, declare the House resolved into the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for consideration of the Bill H.R. 1745 to designate certain public lands in the state of Utah as wilderness and for